Have you ever wondered what drives a man to drive his ship directly into the steel side of a giant, knowing full well that only death awaits in the cold water? Most legends are born from clever tactics or superior firepower, but the story of the HMS Glowworm is a raw, heart-pounding tale of pure, unadulterated defiance against impossible odds. In the freezing mist of the North Sea, a tiny British destroyer found itself face-to-face with the crushing weight of a Nazi heavy cruiser, the Admiral Hipper. To the German sailors, the Glowworm was a nuisance to be swatted away, a small shadow in the spray that had no business challenging their massive and armored might. But to those on the British deck, she was a flickering light of courage that refused to be extinguished by the overwhelming fire of a superior enemy fleet. The fascination with the Glowworm lies in that final suicidal decision to use the ship itself as a weapon, a move that left even the Germans in awe of such spirit. My name is a ghost of that storm now, but I remember the morning of April 8, 1940, when the waves were taller than mountains and the air was thick with the scent of doom. The fascination with the Glowworm began with a simple stroke of bad luck. A sailor lost overboard in a violent gale that forced the ship to separate from its escort. The psychological weight of being alone in the North Sea, surrounded by the enemy's invasion force, was a shadow that grew darker with every passing minute of the storm. The secret flaw of her situation was the isolation, as the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and its escorting destroyers were already closing the distance through the thick and gray fog. We saw the first silhouettes break through the mist, not friends as we had hoped, but the cold and sharp lines of the German Kriegsmarine's finest steel. The fascination of the crew was a sharpened focus, a transition from a rescue mission to a fight for survival that required every ounce of our remaining energy. We knew we were outgunned, our small 4-inch barrels looking like toys against the massive 8-inch guns of the heavy cruiser that loomed above the waves. The air was freezing, but our blood was beginning to boil with the realization that this would be the final test of our duty and our lives. The psychological weight of the first German salvos was like a physical blow, the massive shells turning the sea into a landscape of towering and violent geysers of salt. The fascination of the Admiral Hipper's accuracy was a terrifying thing to witness, as their radar-directed fire began to walk toward our thin and unarmored and fragile hull. The secret flaw of the Glowworm was our vulnerability. A single direct hit from an 8-inch shell could dismantle our superstructure and send us to the deep. Yet, Lieutenant Commander Roope did not turn away, instead choosing to weave through the spray, using the smoke and the waves to hide our desperate movements. The fascination of the ship's agility was our only defense, a frantic dance on the edge of a knife as the German giant searched for our vital organs. Every man at his station felt the vibration of the near misses, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like the drumbeat of a funeral march across the freezing and dark water. We were a small light in a very dark world, but we were determined to burn as brightly as possible before the end finally claimed us. I remember the secret flaw of our torpedo attack, a desperate gamble that was foiled by the heavy seas and the expert maneuvering of the German cruiser's skilled captain. The fascination of the moment was the sight of our steel fish leaping through the waves only to be avoided by the Hipper as she turned her bow toward us. The psychological weight of that failure was immense, as we realized our primary teeth had been pulled, and we were now essentially defenseless against the enemy's fire. The Glowworm was being shredded, her wireless room destroyed, and her bridge a jagged mess of shrapnel and broken glass and the scent of burning oil. Yet the guns we had left kept barking, a defiant response to the overwhelming power that was systematically tearing our small home into pieces of scrap. The fascination of the crew was their refusal to acknowledge the inevitable, a shared madness that kept them loading shells even as the deck tilted beneath their feet. We were a ship of 300 souls, but in that moment, we were a single mind focused on the impossible task of wounding a giant. The psychological weight of the decision to ram was a silent realization that passed between the officers as the distance between the two ships began to close rapidly. The fascination of Roope's final order was its simplicity. If we could not sink her with shells or torpedoes, we would break her with our own very bones. The secret flaw of the Hipper was her overconfidence, as she drew closer to finish off the crippled destroyer, assuming the fight was already over and won. We saw the massive bow of the German cruiser, a mountain of steel that seemed to fill the entire horizon as we turned our rudder for the final strike. The fascination of the collision course was a moment of absolute clarity, where fear was replaced by a cold and focused intent to leave a mark on history. We were moving at full speed through the churning waves, a small arrow of iron aimed directly at the heart of the Nazi giant that had tried to kill us. The air was filled with the roar of the engines and the scream of the wind, a chaotic symphony that led us toward the final and fatal impact. I often think about the secret flaw of the Admiral Hipper's armor, which was designed to deflect shells, but not to withstand the direct impact of a 1,000-ton destroyer. The fascination of the impact was not a single sound, but a prolonged and terrifying screech of metal as our bow tore into the cruiser's starboard side. The psychological weight of the jolt threw men across the decks, the force of the collision vibrating through the ship and into the very marrow of our aching bones. We saw the German steel buckle and tear, a jagged wound opening in her side that would later require weeks of repair and a long retreat. The fascination of the moment was the sight of our own bow crumbling like paper, the glowworm sacrificing herself to deliver a blow that the enemy would never forget. We had done it. We had reached the giant, and we had bitten her with a ferocity that defied every rule of naval engagement and logic. The ship was dying, but she was dying on her own terms, a champion of the small and the brave against the massive and the cruel. The psychological weight of the silence that followed the impact was a haunting thing, as the glowworm drifted away from the giant she had just wounded so deeply. The fascination of the sight was the Hipper's smoke, a black plume that matched the fires burning on our own shattered and broken and sinking and lonely deck. The secret flaw of our survival was that there was none. The ship was finished, her hull open to the sea, and her lifeblood leaking into the cold and dark water. We heard the final groans of the metal as the glowworm began to roll, a slow and majestic surrender to the ocean that had been her home. The fascination of the crew was the calm with which they prepared to enter the freezing water, a quiet dignity that was born from the knowledge of their success. We had done what we came to do, and the giant was now limping, her pride wounded by a ship that she had dismissed as a minor and insignificant threat. The morning was still gray, and the waves were still high, but the glowworm had finally found her peace in the middle of the storm. I remember the secret flaw of the North Sea's temperature, which was so cold that it felt like 1,000 needles piercing our skin the moment we touched the water. The fascination of the rescue was the sight of the Admiral Hipper returning, her captain so impressed by our bravery that he ordered his men to save us. The psychological weight of being pulled from the sea by the very enemy we had just rammed was a strange and confusing irony that we struggled to process. We saw the German sailors lining the rails, looking down at us with a mixture of respect and awe that transcended the hatred of the war. The fascination of the human spirit was revealed in that moment, a shared recognition of courage that bridged the gap between the victor and the defeated and the dead. We were the survivors of the glowworm, and though we were prisoners, we carried a pride that no cage could ever hope to contain or to break. The giant was wounded, and the small ship was gone, but the story of their encounter was already becoming a legend of the dark and cold sea. The psychological weight of the report sent by the German captain to the British Admiralty was the ultimate secret flaw in the Nazi propaganda of the time. The fascination of the recommendation was that it came from the enemy, a request that Commander Roope be awarded the Victoria Cross for his incredible bravery. This act of chivalry was a rare light in the darkness of the Second World War, a testament to the code of the sea that still existed. The fascination of the glowworm's legacy is this unique recognition, a story of a suicidal attack that earned the highest honors from both sides of the conflict. We realized then that the size of the ship was irrelevant. What mattered was the size of the heart of the men who sailed her into the fire. The secret flaw of the Admiral Hipper was that she was just a machine, but the glowworm was a spirit, a flame that would burn in the history of the Royal Navy forever. We were the ghosts of that morning, the witnesses to a moment where a small light blinded a giant and changed the way we saw courage. As the years pass, the fascination with the secret flaw of the glowworm's stand remains a beacon for all who face impossible odds in their own and quiet lives. The psychological weight of the story is its power to inspire, a reminder that defiance is always possible, even when the horizon is full of monsters. We look at the empty North Sea and we see her still, a small destroyer charging through the mist with her guns barking and her bow aimed high. The fascination of her memory is the way it refuses to sink, a story that is told and retold by those who value the spirit over the steel. The glowworm is at rest now, a part of the seabed off the coast of Norway, finally silent after her final and thunderous and glorious act. We are the guardians of her flame, the ones who ensure that the world remembers the name of the ship that rammed a Nazi giant. The morning is over, the storm has passed, and the glowworm is a light that will shine in the dark of history for all time. The fascination with the immediate aftermath of the impact was the sight of the Admiral Hipper shuddering like a living creature that had been struck in its very heart. The psychological weight of the damage was invisible to us at first, hidden beneath the waterline where the glowworm's bow had sliced through the heavy belt. The secret flaw of the German cruiser's sophisticated hull was that it was not designed for a side-on collision with a dense and high-speed mass of British steel. We saw the German sailors running to their damage control stations, their faces reflecting a shock that matched the violent and sudden physical jolt of the blow. The fascination of the scene was the slow, agonizing separation of the two ships, as the glowworm scraped along the cruiser's side with a screech of tearing metal. We were a mangled ruin of a ship, our forward section gone, yet the spirit on our deck was a roaring and unyielding fire. The psychological weight of the sinking was now a certainty, but we watched the giant limp away with a grim and silent satisfaction. We had left our mark in the form of a 40-meter gash that would drain the enemy's pride and her vital and oily blood. The psychological weight of the end of the glowworm was felt as the sea began to reclaim the decks that had been our home for so many cold months. The fascination of her final moments was her dignity. She did not roll over in a panic, but settled into the waves with a majestic and quiet grace. The secret flaw of our survival was the lack of functional lifeboats, as most had been reduced to splinters by the German shells earlier in the fight. We were forced to rely on Carly floats and our own life jackets, small and flimsy barriers against the immense and freezing power of the North Sea. The fascination of the crew was their discipline, standing in line as the water reached their waists, waiting for the final command to abandon the ship. We felt the cold rising, a numbing sensation that began to drain the heat from our bodies and the strength from our very tired and aching limbs. The psychological weight of the abyss was a physical presence, a dark and hungry void that was waiting just inches below the surface of the salt. Every man took a breath of the freezing air, knowing it might be the last time his lungs would ever feel the sweetness of the world. I remember the secret flaw of the North Sea's currents, which pulled the survivors away from the sinking ship with a force that was both silent and terrifyingly strong. The fascination of the struggle was the sight of the glowworm's stern rising into the air, the propellers still and silent against the gray and weeping morning sky. The psychological weight of that image, our ship standing vertical before the plunge, is a memory that remains etched into the minds of every man who saw it. We watched as she finally slid beneath the waves, leaving nothing but a patch of white foam and a spreading slick of black and bitter oil. The fascination of the silence that followed was absolute, a quiet that was broken only by the sound of the wind and the cries of the men. We were alone in a graveyard of water, hundreds of miles from help, drifting in a sea that was cold enough to stop a heart. The secret flaw of our bravery was the cost, a heavy price paid in the blood of our brothers who did not make it off the deck. We were the remnants of a legend, floating in the dark and waiting for a rescue that seemed like a distant and impossible dream. The psychological weight of the hypothermia was a slow and insidious thief, stealing our thoughts and our will to keep our heads above the rising and freezing waves. The fascination of the rescue was the sudden return of the Admiral Hipper, which maneuvered back toward the survivors instead of continuing her mission to the north. The secret flaw of the German mission was this delay, a humanitarian pause that allowed the Royal Navy to eventually track the cruiser's position more effectively. We saw the massive hull of the enemy ship looming over us again, but this time, it was not to fire, but to offer a desperate and cold lifeline. The fascination of the German sailors was their silence as they lowered nets and ropes into the water, looking at us with a profound and quiet respect. The psychological weight of being saved by the man who just tried to kill you is a complexity that few human beings will ever truly understand. We were being pulled from the jaws of death by the very hand that had forced us into the water. A strange and haunting mercy. Every man who reached the deck of the cruiser felt the sting of the warmth and the heavy burden of his new status as a prisoner. I often think about the secret flaw of the German captain's heart, which was moved by a sense of naval chivalry that was already becoming rare in the Second World War. The fascination of Captain High was his decision to treat the British survivors with a dignity that was usually reserved for his own German and loyal sailors. The psychological weight of his command was a bridge between two worlds, a moment where the rules of the sea overrode the hateful and violent ideology of the war. We were given dry clothes and warm food, sitting in the mess of the enemy while the ship we had just rammed groaned from its deep and jagged wounds. The fascination of the interaction was the quiet exchange of looks between the crews, a recognition of the shared risk that all sailors face in the deep. The secret flaw of the war was that it forced men who respected each other to kill each other in the name of flags and distant and cold leaders. We were the proof that even in the middle of a slaughter, there is a space for honor and a place for the human spirit. The glowworm was gone, but her spirit was now a guest on the very ship she had tried to destroy in the storm. The psychological weight of the missing was a heavy fog that descended upon the survivors as we began to count the faces that were no longer among us. The fascination of the loss was the realization that Commander Roope was not there, having stayed in the water to help his men until his own strength finally failed. The secret flaw of his heroism was its selflessness, a choice that saved many of us, but cost him the life he had so bravely and fiercely defended. We saw the German sailors searching the water for him, a tribute to the man who had given them the fight of their lives just an hour before. The fascination of his absence was a void in our group, a silence that spoke louder than any words of praise or any medals of gold could ever achieve. We were the survivors of his command, the living legacy of a man who believed that the ship and the crew were one and the same. The psychological weight of our survival was a debt we owed to him, a promise to remember the light of the glowworm in the dark of the coming years. Every man on that cruiser felt the shadow of the fallen, a heavy and silent presence that would never truly leave our tired souls. I remember the secret flaw of the German cruiser's damage, which was far more severe than the initial reports had suggested to the High Command in Berlin and Tokyo. The fascination of the engineering was that the glowworm's bow had bypassed the outer armor and struck the internal bulkheads that protected the ship's vital and complex machinery. The psychological weight of the repairs was a burden on the German Navy, as the Hipper was forced to retreat and spend weeks in a dry dock in Norway. This secret flaw in their schedule saved countless Allied merchant ships, as the cruiser was unable to carry out its planned and lethal raids on the convoys. The fascination of our sacrifice was the strategic impact, a small ship changing the fate of a campaign through a single and desperate act of raw and metal violence. We had failed to sink her, but we had crippled her, and in the mathematics of war, that was a victory that was worth every drop of our blood. The glowworm was a tiny insect that had paralyzed a giant, a story of impact that would be studied by naval officers for many decades to come. The psychological weight of the journey to the prisoner of war camps was a long and dark road that began on the deck of the very ship we had fought. The fascination of our status was our uniqueness. We were the men who rammed the Hipper, a title that earned us a strange kind of celebrity among the guards. The secret flaw of our captivity was the pride we carried, a mental shield that kept us from breaking under the pressure of the bars and the cold. We realized that the glowworm had not just left a mark on the German cruiser, but on the history of the Royal Navy and the world. The fascination of the legend was its growth, as the story of our stand was told and retold in the whispered conversations of the camps and the barracks. We were the witnesses to a moment of pure defiance, a story that reminded our fellow prisoners that the enemy was not invincible and that the giant could be bitten. The psychological weight of the bars was lighter, because we knew we had done our duty to the very end of the ship's life. Every day in the camp was a day closer to the time when we could finally tell the world what happened in the mist. I often think about the secret flaw of the German captain's letter, which he sent through the Red Cross to the British Admiralty to tell them of our bravery. The fascination of the act was its purity, a gesture of respect from one sailor to another that ignored the politics and the hatred of the Nazi regime. The psychological weight of that letter was the reason Commander Roope was awarded the Victoria Cross, the only time such an honor was given based on an enemy's recommendation. This secret flaw in the war's usual cruelty is the most beautiful part of the Glowworm story, a reminder that honor is a universal and powerful language. The fascination of the medal was that it belonged to the whole crew, a recognition of the collective spirit that had driven us into the side of the giant. We were the ghosts of the North Sea, but we were ghosts with a name and a story that the world was now beginning to hear and to cherish. The Glowworm was a small ship, but she had cast a shadow that was larger than any cruiser and more enduring than any and violent storm. As the second part of our journey ends, the fascination with the Glowworm's impact remains a symbol of the little man standing up to the overwhelming and cold and massive power. The psychological weight of the story is the realization that one person, one ship, and one decision can alter the course of history and the hearts of men. The secret flaw of the giant is that it is often slow and overconfident, while the small and the brave are quick and determined and full of a burning and bright fire. We are the survivors of the impact, the ones who felt the metal scream and the ocean rise to meet us in the middle of the dark and gray night. The fascination of the memory is its intensity, a fire that never goes out even as the years pass and the world moves on into the light of the peace. The Glowworm is a light that will shine as long as men tell stories of the sea and the courage it takes to sail into the fire. We are ready for the final chapters, for the legacy and the closure that only the passing of the long and silent and cold years can bring. The fascination with the prisoner of war camps was the slow realization that our story had traveled much faster than we had ever anticipated or dared to hope. The psychological weight of the barbed wire was countered by the whispers of other captives who already knew about the destroyer that had rammed the Nazi giant. The secret flaw of our captivity was the pride we held in our hearts, a fire that no amount of hunger or cold could ever truly extinguish. We were the men of the Glowworm, and even our German guards seemed to look at us with a strange and quiet respect that crossed the front lines. The fascination of our identity was a shield against the despair that often consumed those who felt forgotten by their country in the middle of the long war. We realized that our act of defiance had become a symbol of resistance, a story of Davy against Goliath that echoed through the barracks and the camps. Every day we spent behind the fence was a day we carried the memory of the North Sea like a secret and powerful weapon of the soul. The psychological weight of the Admiral Hipper's wounds was a constant topic of conversation among those of us who had seen the impact with our very eyes. The fascination of the technical damage was that the cruiser was plagued by structural issues and leaks long after the jagged hole had been patched and painted over. The secret flaw of the repair was the internal misalignment caused by the sheer force of the Glowworm's 1,000-ton bow striking the main armored belt of the ship. We heard rumors from the shipyard workers that the cruiser would never be the same, her speed reduced and her spirit broken by a small British ship. The fascination of this strategic victory was a comfort to us in the dark, knowing that our sacrifice had removed a major predator from the Atlantic. We had traded a single destroyer for the operational health of a heavy cruiser, a mathematical victory that justified the blood we had left in the waves. The giant was limping through the war, a silent testament to the ferocity of the small light that had dared to strike her in the storm. I remember the secret flaw of the Red Cross letters, which were our only link to the families who had been told that we were missing in the sea. The fascination of the weight was a psychological torture, as weeks turned into months of silence before the first confirmation of our survival finally reached the home shore. The psychological weight of the unknown was a burden shared by our mothers and wives, who lived in a limbo of hope and grief in the middle of London. We wrote about the food and the weather, never mentioning the screams or the sight of our ship standing vertical before she took the final and fatal plunge. The fascination of the sanitized reality was a way to protect them from the horror of the battle that still played in our dreams every single night. We were the ghosts of the Glowworm, and while our bodies were in a camp, our spirits were still drifting in the cold and dark waters off Norway. Every letter we received was a reminder of why we had fought, a connection to a world of green fields that felt like a distant dream. The psychological weight of Commander Roope's absence was a shadow that grew longer as the war dragged on, and the hopes for a swift victory began to fade. The fascination of his leadership was the primary subject of our whispered stories, a way to keep his memory alive among the men he had saved from the deep. The secret flaw of our survival was the guilt of being the ones who made it to the deck of the cruiser while he vanished in the salt. We spoke of his calm voice on the bridge, the way he looked at the Hipper, and saw an opportunity where others would only see a certain death. The fascination of his final act, helping men into the nets before being swept away, was the ultimate proof of the character of the British naval officer of that era. We knew that he was the heart of the ship, and without him, the Glowworm would have just been another casualty in a long and bloody list of losses. He was the one who had turned a defeat into a legend, a man whose bravery was so absolute that even the enemy could not ignore it. I often think about this secret flaw of the German sailors' interactions with us, as they tried to reconcile our humanity with the propaganda of the Nazi regime. The fascination of the quiet moments was the shared cigarette or the nod of respect from a guard who had been a merchant sailor before the Great War. The psychological weight of the ideology was a thin veil that often tore when faced with the raw reality of the shared experiences of the sea. We saw in their eyes a reflection of our own fear and our own weariness, a realization that we were all just pawns in a much larger and darker game. The fascination of the naval brotherhood was a powerful thing, a code that suggested the ocean was a much more dangerous enemy than the men on the other deck. The secret flaw of the conflict was that it asked us to hate the very people who shared our same love for the wind and the salt waves. We were prisoners, but we were also witnesses to a common humanity that the war tried so very hard to destroy and to silence forever. The fascination with the Glowworm's legend grew in the British Admiralty as the details of the German captain's letter began to circulate through the High Command in London. The psychological weight of the story was a much-needed boost for a nation that was facing the darkness of the Blitz and the threat of an invasion. The secret flaw of the usual military secrecy was cast aside to tell the tale of the destroyer that had rammed the giant to save its honor. We were the heroes of the morning papers, though we were sitting in a cold camp in Germany, unaware of the impact our act had on the world. The fascination of the lone light was a spark of hope for millions of people who felt overwhelmed by the massive and industrial power of the Nazi war machine. We were proof that the spirit could overcome the steel, that the small could wound the great, and that courage was still a vital and living force. The psychological weight of the war was lightened for a moment by the story of a small ship that refused to turn away from the fire. I remember the secret flaw of the camp's library, where we found old books on naval history that made us feel like we were part of a long and noble and ancient tradition. The fascination of the continuity was a psychological anchor, a feeling that our struggle was just another chapter in the story of the men who sailed the deep. The psychological weight of the boredom was the new enemy, a slow rot of the mind that we fought with drills, games, and the constant retelling of the battle. We drew maps of the North Sea in the dirt, tracing the path of the glowworm as she weaved through the shells and the spray of the storm. The fascination of the memory was its clarity. We could still hear the screech of the metal and feel the jolt of the impact in our very bones. We were a ship's company in exile, a crew without a hull, but the bond between us was as strong as the steel we had lost. Every day was a battle of endurance, a test of whether we could keep our dignity in a place designed to strip it away from us. The psychological weight of the German captain's chivalry was something that stayed with us as we watched the war turn against the country that held us in its cold grip. The fascination of Captain High's character was a mystery to many of our fellow prisoners who had experienced only the cruelty of the SS and the Gestapo. The secret flaw of his act was that it reminded us that honor was not the property of any one nation or any one single and violent and dark ideology. We realized that he had risked his own standing within the Nazi military to ensure that our bravery was officially recognized by our own and distant government. The fascination of this honor among enemies was a rare and beautiful thing in a conflict that was otherwise defined by a total and absolute lack of mercy. It gave us a sense of purpose, a feeling that we had participated in something that was larger than the violence and the hatred of the battlefield. We were the witnesses to a moment of grace, a story that would eventually become one of the most famous legends of the entire and terrible war. I often think about the secret flaw of the camp's secret radio, which brought us news of the Royal Navy's growing power and the eventual sinking of the great German ships. The fascination of the news was a source of quiet celebration, a feeling that the tide was finally turning back toward the light and the freedom we loved. The psychological weight of the news was a jolt of energy, a reminder that our sacrifice had been part of a much larger and successful effort to win the sea. We heard of the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst, and we thought of the Hipper, wondering if she was still feeling the ache of the wound we had given her. The fascination of the global struggle was a way to see past the barbed wire and the gray walls of our cell and into the future. We were the ghosts of the glowworm, and we were waiting for the day when the dawn would finally return to the world and to our lives. The secret flaw of the enemy was that they could cage our bodies, but they could never truly cage the spirit of the ship we had sailed. As the third part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the glowworm's legacy is a testament to the power of a single act of pure and raw defiance. The psychological weight of the years in the camp was a long and cold winter, but the memory of the impact was a fire that kept us warm. The secret flaw of the giant was revealed in every story we told, that the massive can be wounded, and that the small can be truly great. We were ready for the end of the war, for the liberation and the return to the sea that had been our first and only and true and beautiful home. The fascination of the return was a hope that sustained us, a dream of seeing the white cliffs of Dover and the gray and rolling waves of the Channel. We are the survivors of the glowworm, and we are the guardians of a story that will live as long as there is salt in the ocean. The light of the glowworm is still burning, a small spark in the dark of history that refuses to be extinguished by the long and silent years. The fascination with the passing seasons inside the camp was a psychological struggle to keep the map of our lives from being erased by the gray monotony of the wire. The psychological weight of the four walls was heavy, but we found that our minds were still sailing the North Sea, reliving the moment of impact over and over. The secret flaw of our imprisonment was the freedom we found in the collective retelling of the glowworm's final hour of life and fire. We formed a secret society of sorts, where the youngest recruits were mentored by the veterans who had felt the jolt of the German cruiser's hull. The fascination of our spirit was a puzzle to our captors, who could not understand why men with nothing left to lose could still laugh and sing. We realized that the ship had not died in the waves, but had been reborn inside each of us as a permanent and indestructible fortress of iron. The psychological weight of the bars was a physical reality, but our identity was anchored in the spray and the salt of a battle that never truly ended. I remember the secret flaw of the German newsreels they showed us, which tried to paint the war as a series of grand and unstoppable victories for the Nazi machine. The fascination of the propaganda was its hollowness, as we knew that the Admiral Hipper was still plagued by the structural scars we had carved into her. The psychological weight of the lies was a burden we threw off with a quiet and knowing smile, aware that the giant was no longer the terror she once was. We heard whispers from new prisoners about the cruiser's long periods in the dry dock, a secret victory that we celebrated in the dark of our barracks. The fascination of the hidden truth was our only luxury, a realization that our small ship had struck a blow that echoed through the entire German naval command. We saw the cracks in the enemy's facade, the slow realization that the war of the seas was turning against them in a tide of fire and blood. The glowworm was a ghost that haunted their fleet, a reminder that the small and the brave were the true masters of the deep and dark ocean. The psychological weight of the hunger was a slow and grinding pressure that tested the limits of our discipline and our loyalty to each other in the camp. The fascination of the human body's resilience was a miracle we witnessed every day, as men shared their meager rations to keep the weakest among us from fading away. The secret flaw of the German supply system was its collapse under the weight of the Allied bombing, a reality that we felt in our empty stomachs and cold bones. Yet, the memory of the glowworm's final charge gave us a mental strength that defied the physical hunger and the exhaustion of the long and silent nights. The fascination of our bond was a wall against the despair, a shared understanding that we had to survive to tell the world what happened in the mist. We were a crew of 300, but in the camp, we were a single soul, protecting the flame of our history from the winter wind of the war. Every day was a battle for dignity, a refusal to let the bars of the cage turn us into the shadows that our captors wanted us to be. I often think about the secret flaw of the camp's hierarchy, where the men of the Glowworm were looked upon as the elders of the captive community regardless of our actual naval rank. The fascination of the respect we received was a heavy responsibility, as we had to set the example of how a British sailor carries himself in the dark. The psychological weight of this role was a source of purpose, a reason to keep our boots polished and our heads held high even in the mud of Germany. We organized classes on navigation and seamanship, teaching the younger boys the art of the sea while the guards watched with a mixture of confusion and awe. The fascination of the classroom was its defiance, a way to prepare for the return to the water while we were still trapped on the dry and dusty land. We were the guardians of a tradition that was older than the war, a code of the sea that the Nazi ideology could never hope to understand. The Glowworm was our school, and the impact with the Hipper was the final and greatest lesson in the power of the human spirit. The psychological weight of the Allied advances began to filter into the camp like a rising tide of hope, carried by the sound of distant bombs and the frantic movements of the guards. The fascination of the changing atmosphere was a jolt of energy that kept us awake at night, listening for the sound of the liberation that we knew was coming. The secret flaw of our captors was their growing fear, a realization that the walls they had built were about to be knocked down by the very world they tried to conquer. We saw the look in their eyes, a reflection of the same shock they must have felt when the Glowworm's bow first struck the side of their heavy cruiser. The fascination of the moment was the reversal of roles, as we became the confident ones while they retreated into the shadows of their own and desperate and failing and dark empire. We were the ghosts of the North Sea, and we were about to be released from the grave of the camp and back into the light. The morning was finally coming, and the Glowworm was still a light that would guide us home through the smoke of the burning and broken land. I remember the secret flaw of the final winter, the coldest of the war, where the wood for the stoves ran out and we slept huddled together for the warmth of our bodies. The fascination of the survival was a testament to the toughness of the men who had been forged in the salt and the spray of the Atlantic gales. The psychological weight of the freezing air was a physical pain, but it couldn't stop us from dreaming of the white cliffs and the gray and rolling waves of the home. We told the story of the ramming again and again, the heat of the fire on the deck serving as a mental blanket against the ice of the German night. The fascination of the narrative was its power to heal, a way to transport ourselves away from the hunger and the cold and back to the deck of our ship. We were the men of the Glowworm, and we knew that if we could survive the fire of the Hipper, we could survive anything the winter could throw at us. The spirit of the ship was our heat, a burning and bright defiance that kept our hearts beating through the long and silent and dark and freezing hours. The psychological weight of the death marches began as the Germans tried to move us away from the advancing Allied armies, a brutal journey through the snow and the ruins of the war. The fascination of the endurance was the way we kept the line, refusing to leave any man behind to the mercy of the guards or the cold and empty road. The secret flaw of the guards was their exhaustion, a realization that they were just as trapped by the war as we were, but without the hope that we held. We saw the ruins of the cities we had only heard about on the radio, a landscape of fire and stone that looked like the end of the world itself. The fascination of the journey was the sight of the German civilians, their faces mirrors of the same shock and despair that we had once felt in the water. We realized then that the war was a tragedy for everyone, a vast and violent storm that had swallowed the innocent and the guilty alike in its gray and cold salt. We were the witnesses to the final collapse, the ghosts of a ship that was finally seeing the light of the liberation on the distant and burning horizon. I often think about the secret flaw of the liberation itself, the moment when the first Allied tanks broke through the wire and the world finally rushed into our long and dark and cold and silent cell. The fascination of the sound was a roar of engines and the cheering of men, a symphony of freedom that was louder than any explosion of the war we had known. The psychological weight of the sudden change was a physical shock, a feeling of being reborn into a world that was suddenly vast and full of a million and bright and beautiful and safe possibilities. We saw the faces of the liberators, young men who looked at us with a mixture of horror and respect, unaware that we were the legends of the North Sea. The fascination of the moment was the realization that we were no longer prisoners, but free men who could finally tell the story of the glowworm to the world. We were the survivors of the impact, and our journey through the dark was finally over, replaced by the light of the dawn and the promise of the return. The ship was at rest, and we were finally going home, the ghosts of the mist returning to the land of the living. The psychological weight of the return to England was a mixture of joy and a deep and quiet grief for the ones who were not there to see the white cliffs of Dover with us. The fascination of the homecoming was the silence of the country, a nation that had been scarred by the war but was still standing tall and proud and free from the fire. The secret flaw of our return was the difficulty of explaining what we had been through, a gap in experience that could never be fully closed by words or medals. We saw our families again, the fascination of their faces a light that finally chased away the shadows of the camp and the dark and freezing and oily water of the sea. The psychological weight of the glowworm legend was a burden we carried with a grim and silent pride, knowing that our act of defiance was now a part of the history. We were the witnesses to a moment of pure courage, a story that would inspire the generation of sailors who would follow us into the deep and dark and cold ocean. The light of the glowworm was still burning, a small spark that had survived the storm and the wire and the winter to shine on the home. As the fourth part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the glowworm's legacy is a testament to the endurance of the spirit through the longest and darkest of nights. The psychological weight of the war was a heavy anchor, but the memory of the impact was the chain that kept us from drifting away into the void. The secret flaw of the enemy was their belief that they could break the heart of the small ship, when they only succeeded in making it a permanent part of the light. We are ready for the final chapters, for the medals and the honors and the long and quiet peace that we earned with our very blood and our very souls. The fascination of the return is a hope fulfilled, a dream of the sea that is no longer a graveyard but a bridge to the future and the light. We are the survivors of the glowworm, and we are the guardians of a story that will live as long as there is salt in the ocean. The dawn is here, the bars are gone, and the glowworm is a light that will shine for all time in the heart of the nation. The fascination with our return to London was the sudden and overwhelming public recognition of an event that had happened in the cold shadows of the war's first and quiet year. The psychological weight of being the living symbols of the glowworm's sacrifice was a burden that felt heavier than the hunger of the camps we had just escaped. The secret flaw of our homecoming was the bittersweet reality of receiving medals for a battle that had taken the lives of so many of our closest and bravest friends. We saw the pride in the eyes of the naval officers at the Admiralty, but our own eyes were searching the crowds for the faces that would never return. The fascination of the legend was now an official part of the British military record, a story that was being used to teach new recruits the meaning of duty. We were no longer just sailors. We were the survivors of an epic, a living testament to the moment when a small destroyer dared to challenge the massive power of a Nazi giant. Every handshake and every salute was a reminder of the price of our legend, a debt paid in the freezing salt water of the distant North Sea. The psychological weight of the Victoria Cross ceremony was a moment of profound and silent reflection as the medal was posthumously awarded to our commander, Gerard Roope. The fascination of the event was the official acknowledgement of the German captain's letter, a rare and beautiful cross-pollination of honor between two bitter and violent and determined enemies. The secret flaw of the award was the hollow feeling in the room, the physical absence of the man whose courage had earned the highest honor of the British Empire. We stood as witnesses for him, a group of tired and pale survivors who knew that his spirit was the only reason we were still standing there. The fascination of the medal was its weight, a simple piece of bronze that represented the ultimate sacrifice and the ultimate defiance of the human spirit in the dark. We realized then that the glowworm would never be forgotten, her name etched into the stone of the nation's history alongside the greatest battles of the past. The light of the ship was now an eternal flame, a spark of hope that would guide the Royal Navy through the challenges of the coming and uncertain peace. I remember the secret flaw of our first visit back to a naval shipyard, where we saw the massive and modern ships that were being built to secure the final victory. The fascination of the progress was a sharp contrast to the aging and small destroyer we had sailed into the fire of the Admiral Hipper's heavy and powerful guns. The psychological weight of the new Navy was a feeling of being a relic, a ghost from a time when the war was still a primitive and raw struggle of iron. We saw the radar arrays and the automated systems, realizing that the era of the close-range ramming attack was likely coming to a permanent and silent end. The fascination of the technology was its precision, a cold and calculated way to kill that lacked the visceral and personal nature of our own and bloody fight. Yet we knew that no machine could ever replace the secret flaw of human courage, the unpredictable element that turns a small ship into a giant slayer in the dark. We were the last of a breed, the men who had fought with the hull itself, using our home as a weapon of last and final and absolute resort. The psychological weight of the Admiral Hipper's final fate was a source of grim and quiet satisfaction, as we learned she had been crippled by Allied bombers in a harbor. The fascination of her end was the lack of glory. She was not sunk in a grand fleet engagement, but was scuttled by her own crew in a shallow and muddy and dark and dirty dock. The secret flaw of her survival after our impact was that she had never truly returned to her former strength, haunted by the structural issues we had gifted her. We saw the photos of her mangled superstructure, a giant that had been brought low not by a battleship, but by the slow and relentless pressure of a losing and desperate war. The fascination of the irony was absolute. The ship that had survived the Glowworm's ramming could not survive the collapse of the empire she was built to serve and protect. We felt a strange sense of closure, knowing that our old enemy was finally dead, her steel being sold for scrap in a world that no longer needed her violence. The giant was gone, and the small ship she had tried to destroy was the one whose name would live on in the hearts of the people. I often think about the secret flaw of the post-war reunions, where the survivors of the Glowworm gathered to talk about the things that no one else could ever truly understand. The fascination of our bond was its intensity, a connection that grew stronger as the world around us changed, and the memories of the war began to fade and blur. The psychological weight of the silence was our common language, a shared understanding of the cold, the sound of the metal, and the sight of the giant in the mist. We saw the faces of our brothers aging, but in our minds, we were always back on that tilting deck, ready to pull the trigger for the final and fatal charge. The fascination of the Glowworm Society was its secrecy, a private world where the light of the ship was still burning brightly in the middle of the quiet and peaceful years. We were the keepers of a flame that the world only saw from the outside, a fire that had been forged in the North Sea and tempered in the camps of the enemy. Every year we met, we were one man fewer, but the story was 1 year stronger, a legend that refused to grow old or to lose its sharp and bitter edge. The psychological weight of the official history books was a struggle to ensure that the small details of our fight were not lost in the grand narratives of the great and famous generals. The fascination of the archival work was the discovery of the German logs, which confirmed the absolute terror that the Glowworm had caused on the bridge of the Admiral Hipper. The secret flaw of the enemy's record was the admission of their own panic, the shock of seeing a small destroyer turn back toward them with a suicidal and focused and terrifying intent. We read the words of the German sailors who were there, and we saw ourselves through their eyes, a small, persistent, and lethal ghost that refused to die or to turn away. The fascination of this dual perspective was the ultimate validation of our sacrifice, a proof that we had achieved exactly what Commander Roope had set out to do in the storm. We were the men who had made a giant blink, a story of impact that was now verified by the very people who had tried to erase us from the sea. The truth was out, and it was a story of a small light that had blinded the great and powerful Nazi machine. I remember the secret flaw of the medals we wore on our civilian suits during the parades, a small piece of metal that felt like it carried the weight of the entire ocean. The fascination of the public's gaze was a mixture of curiosity and a distant and respectful awe that made us feel like we were from another and much older world. The psychological weight of the Glowworm VC was the centerpiece of our identity, a symbol of a courage that was so absolute it defied the very boundaries of the war's usual hatred. We saw the young children look at us, and we wondered if they could ever imagine the sound of the 8-inch shells or the smell of the burning and oily gasoline. The fascination of the legacy was its ability to bridge the generations, a story of Davi and Goliath that was as relevant in the peace as it was in the middle of the fire. We were the ambassadors of a vanished era, the representatives of a ship that had been gone for decades but was still sailing in the collective mind of the nation. Every step we took in the parade was a step for the men who couldn't, a march for the light that would never truly go out. The psychological weight of the deep-sea search for the wreck of the Glowworm was a new and fascinating chapter that began as technology finally allowed us to look into the abyss. The fascination of the underwater images was the sight of the hull, resting in the dark silt of the North Sea like a silent and sleeping and peaceful warrior of the past. The secret flaw of her remains was the violence of her end, the bow gone and the metal twisted by the force of the ramming and the pressure of the deep. We saw the guns that we had manned, now covered in the life of the sea, a transformation from a weapon of war into a sanctuary for the creatures of the salt. The fascination of her resting place was its loneliness, a quiet that was the only appropriate end for a ship that had lived through such a thunderous and glorious and final hour. We felt a sense of peace seeing her there, knowing that she was still on station guarding the waters where she had earned her place in the history of the world. The Glowworm was at rest, a part of the ocean floor, a secret that was finally and fully and beautifully revealed to the light. I often think about the secret flaw of the stories we told our grandchildren, the way we had to soften the edges of the horror to keep the light of the legend burning brightly. The fascination of their questions was a reminder of the purity of their hope, a belief that the good ship always wins and that the heroes always come back home from the sea. The psychological weight of the truth was something we kept for ourselves, the memory of the cold and the screams that would never fit into a bedtime story of the brave and the bold. We saw in their eyes the same fascination that had once driven us to the sea, a love for the adventure and the mystery of the wide and gray and rolling and powerful ocean. The secret flaw of our life was that we were always half underwater, a part of us still clinging to the Carly floats while the other part sat in a warm and safe and quiet chair. We were the bridges between the past and the future, the keepers of a flame that would be passed down to those who would never have to feel the heat of the fire. As the fifth part of our journey reaches its conclusion, the fascination with the Glowworm's impact remains a symbol of the power of a single act of defiance in a dark world. The psychological weight of the story is the realization that honor is a force that transcends the war, the enemy, and the very passage of the long and silent and cold years. The secret flaw of the giant was revealed in every medal and every book, that the massive can be humbled by the small, and that the brave are never truly and utterly alone. We are ready for the final chapter, for the closing of the circle and the final farewell to the ship that gave us our names, and our pride, and our souls. The fascination of the end is the peace of the horizon, a light that is no longer a flame of war, but a glow of memory that will shine for all time. We are the survivors of the Glowworm, and our story is a gift to the sea that we loved, and the nation that we served with every drop of our blood. The fascination with the legacy of the HMS Glowworm is the enduring light she cast upon the very concept of naval honor, and the spirit of the individual sailor. The psychological weight of her sacrifice remains a cornerstone of the Royal Navy's identity, a story that proves the heart of a crew is more powerful than any caliber of gun. The secret flaw of the entire Norwegian campaign was a series of tactical failures, yet this single act of defiance redeemed the pride of a fleet in its darkest hour. We look back at the jagged gash in the Admiral Hipper's hull and see it not just as damaged steel, but as the signature of a ship that refused to be forgotten. The fascination of the Glowworm is that she achieved a level of immortality usually reserved for the great battleships, yet she did it as a humble, lonely destroyer in a cold and gray sea. We were the men who sailed her into the fire, and even as the world moved into an era of missiles and satellites, the echo of our impact remained. The small ship is at rest now, a silent sentinel in the depths off Norway, finally free from the roar of the engines and the scream of the wind. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our shared memory is the bittersweet realization that our greatest victory was also our most absolute and final loss of the war. The fascination of the glowworm today is found in the quiet halls of museums where the Victoria Cross of Commander Roope sits as a silent testament to the impossible. We see the replica models of our small ship, and we remember the way the deck vibrated under our feet as we charged toward the wall of German steel. The fascination of the story is its purity, a fight where Davy did not just throw a stone but threw his entire world at the giant to stop the advance. We carry the memory of the salt on our lips and the heat of the boilers in our souls, a sacred trust for those who were lost in the freezing spray. The ship was a spark in a global storm, but in the annals of naval warfare, she has become a roaring sun that illuminates the meaning of courage. Every year that passes only deepens the respect for the small destroyer that looked at a heavy cruiser and decided to never, ever turn away. I remember the secret flaw of the final meeting of the survivors, where the room felt crowded not just with old men, but with the ghosts of the friends we left behind. The fascination of that final gathering was the sense that our mission was finally complete, the story told, and the legacy secured for the generations of sailors to come. The psychological weight of the history was no longer a burden, but a comfortable cloak that we wore with a quiet and dignified pride as the sun set. We saw the same fire in the eyes of the young naval cadets who came to hear us speak, a flame that assured us the spirit of the glowworm would never die. The fascination of the impact is the way it continues to ripple through time, inspiring those who find themselves outgunned and outnumbered in their own private and silent battles. We were the voices for the men who stayed with the hull, the ones who had to ensure the world knew the price and the glory of that April morning. The glowworm was a small ship with a giant soul, and she will forever be the light that shines in the middle of the dark and cold sea. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our survival is the question of why we were given the long years of peace, while our captain was taken by the tide. The fascination of the survivor's guilt is a companion that walks beside us, a reminder that we were saved by a man who placed our lives above his own. We see the face of Commander Roope in the white foam of every wave, a vision of the leader who gave the Royal Navy its most selfless and brave example. The fascination of the glowworm is his story, the story of the man who helped his crew into the nets of the enemy while his own strength was failing. We are the keepers of his legacy, the ones who must ensure that the lone destroyer is remembered as a human triumph, and not just a cold and technical naval event. The ship was a weapon, but she was also a sanctuary for a spirit that was too large for any single hull to contain or to hide. The giant is silent now, but her memory is a roaring tide that never truly recedes from the shores of our tired and heavy and proud minds. I often think about the secret flaw of the ocean's depth, which keeps the glowworm in a state of eternal and freezing and silent and dark and absolute perfection forever. The fascination of the deep-sea currents that move through her bridge is a thought that brings a strange sense of comfort to the few of us who still remain. The psychological weight of the pressure at those depths is a physical barrier that keeps the secrets of our final hours safe from the noise of the living. We imagine her there, her bow still crumpled from the impact, her guns still aimed at the ghost of the cruiser that has long since been turned into scrap. The fascination of her final state is her peace, a quiet that she earned through the trauma of her suicidal charge and her violent and sudden end. We are the last ones who can still feel the jolt of the collision, the ones who know that she was real, even if the world sees her only as a legend. The glowworm was our ship, our pride, and our life, and she will sail on in the darkness of the North Sea as long as the tides turn. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ramming is that it created a legend that was neither a victory nor a defeat, but a transcendent act of absolute and raw will. The psychological weight of that moment was the reason we survived the camps, a lesson in the power of the mind to overcome the limitations of the cold steel. We see the same spirit in the faces of those who refuse to give up today, the ones who drive their own hearts into the giants of their own and difficult lives. The fascination of the glowworm is its universality, a story of defiance that belongs to anyone who has ever felt the weight of an impossible and dark horizon. We were the witnesses to that spirit, the men who had to live with the consequences of a decision that was made in a split second of fire. The ship was a legend before she ever hit the water, a vessel that was destined to be a light for those who sail in the dark. The glowworm was a giant in disguise, and her memory is the armor that we wear against the cold and the silent years of the end. I remember the secret flaw of the final sunset I watched from the cliffs, looking out over the water where the glowworm still lies in her quiet and deep grave. The fascination of the horizon was the feeling that she was still out there, her masts just below the line of the sea, waiting for the return of the pack. The psychological weight of the memory is a bridge to a past that feels more vibrant than the world of today, a world of iron and true honor. We feel the presence of our ship in the movement of the air, a reminder that she is still on her final patrol, guarding the nation. The fascination of the survivor is the ability to see the world with the eyes of a ghost, to know the value of a single and brave breath. We were the crew of the ship that rammed a giant, and our journey will only end when we join our brothers in the long and silent rest. The glowworm is a light that will never go out, a spark of the sea that will shine for all time in the heart of the world. The psychological weight of the secret flaw in our history is that it reminds us that true greatness is often found in the small and the overlooked and the brave. The fascination of the glowworm story is a gift of perspective, a chance to see that one ship can change the heart of an enemy and the soul of a nation. We don't need the world to understand the horror of the storm. We only need the sea to remember the weight of the steel and the silence of the end. The fascination of the destroyer is her mystery, a story that grows more beautiful with every decade that passes without another like her in the sea. She is the shadow of the Hipper, the pride of the Admiralty, and the most heroic secret of the Royal Navy's final and desperate and dark and cold and silent end. The glowworm is a ghost, and we are the haunted, and the story of our final impact is a flame that will burn in the dark forever. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ocean's memory is that it does not care about the medals or the speeches or the long and detailed books of men. The psychological weight of the wreck of the glowworm is its honesty, a physical fact that remains unchanged by the passing of the years or the changing of the world. We imagine the sand settling on the 4-inch guns, the rust eating away at the nameplate, and the deep sea life moving through the silent and empty engine room. The fascination of her final state is a peace that we will never know, a quiet that is the only appropriate end for a ship born in such fire. We are the last link to that morning in 1940, the only ones who can still feel the jolt of the giant before we were thrown into the sea. The psychological weight of the history is a light that shines on the truth of our courage and the scale of our heroic and monumental and naval stand. The glowworm was a giant, and her grave is as vast and as proud as the light she gave to the world in the dark. If the epic and suicidal bravery of the HMS Glowworm and her legendary ramming of the Nazi giant has inspired you, please consider subscribing for more tales of the sea. We are dedicated to telling the stories of the small ships that performed the greatest acts of courage and the men who faced the giants without a single flinch. The fascination with the lone destroyer is a tribute to the power of defiance and the incredible and silent honor of the deep and dark and cold ocean. Comment below. Do you believe the glowworm's act was the bravest in naval history, or is there another ship that matches her incredible and fiery spirit? Share this story of the light in the mist to help us keep the memory of Commander Roope and his crew alive for a new generation. Your support allows us to explore the secret flaws of history and bring the heroic ghosts of the deep back into the light of the modern world. Thank you for sailing with us today through the storm, and for remembering the small ship that dared to ram a Nazi giant.